we started to realize that there is a lot of value that we could give to developers who are building applications, no matter if those applications are SaaS, internal applications, customer identity portals. Instead of like building this kind of single sign-on portal, why don't we go a step below that, like a building block for developers to do your own? Like you could build your single sign-on portal, you could build your SaaS application. Everything would use this kind of like identity platform building blocks, and we would make it easy for developers to embed this functionality within.
You're listening to the Enterprise Ready podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of EnterpriseReady and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The Enterprise Ready podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io.
In this episode of the Enterprise Ready podcast, Grant sits down with Matias Woloski, CTO and co-founder of Auth0, a platform dedicated to making the internet safer by providing an essential building block for applications, authentication, and authorization. We begin with a dive into Matias's background in enterprise software, where he cut his teeth founding Southworks and working as an enterprise architect. During this time, Matias would go on to co-author 2 books, one of which, A Guide to Claims-Based Identity and Access Control, would signal an architectural shift in how the world viewed authentication and identity, a precursor to the now universally accepted single sign-on. Upon seeing an opportunity amongst the now increasing number of applications moving to the cloud, Auth0 emerged as a response to how authentication needed to change alongside this shift. Grant and Matias go on to discuss how understanding developers can be an integral part of finding a product market fit, and how landing your first enterprise customer is a pivotal part of an organization's journey. Finally, they touch on the unique role of the CTO at enterprise software companies and how that title's responsibility aren't universally set in stone, as well as how finding the right person-organization fit can accelerate hiring the right people for enterprise software organizations. All this and much more in this brand new episode. Many thanks to Matias for his time, and we hope you enjoy.
All right, Matias, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's dive on in. Tell us about your background and sort of, how you got into enterprise software and the foundations for Auth0.
Yeah, absolutely. So Auth0 started in 2013. Before that, I co-founded a consulting company out of university, kind of middle way. And so Auth0 was really my first kind of product company as a founder. Consulting is a complete different thing, as we all know. You're building for others and kind of small projects, and you're not really going all the way. But it was a great learning, and of course, it was the reason why I started Auth0 as well, because we started in 2004, I think was this company, and we would work for Microsoft, and that's how I met my co-founder, Eugenio. He was working at a group called Parents and Practices. Back then, Microsoft was trying to get into the enterprise, especially Java was kind of the dominant player. Microsoft released .NET as a way to counter Java and becoming and SQL Server. And it was that time, and I learned a lot throughout that time from Microsoft, like kind of seeing a big company operate at the level that Microsoft does, and the idea that the product is not just a product, the code it's much bigger than that. And in fact, I was helping a team that was part of this more than that, right? It was a team that was kind of evangelizing the platform, that was helping customers to be more successful with the platform, which is kind of initially when we start a company, you don't do that, but you can, seeing that at scale at Microsoft was a big learning. But coming back with how Auth0 started, one of the things that happens throughout that time from 2004 to 2012, which is when I was working at this company, After the
And what's the name of that company, by the way?
The name of the company is Southworks. It's a company from Argentina. Still exists.
Cool.
I was doing essentially like offshore development. It was boutique. That was like our main customer was Microsoft. But anyway, the thing was that after the whole .NET stuff in 2006-7, the whole Azure thing, Azure Web came in, and similarly, like there was a shift in the way that companies would develop applications now in the cloud, and how they could move to the cloud was kind of like a blank canvas, right? Like one of the things that was more complex about moving to the cloud was identity, how you deal with authentication. Remember back in the days, companies would have their own data center, their own kind of Active Directory deployed, their own kind of web server. And it was kind of this kind of walled garden of Microsoft products, or, SAP or Oracle.
Sure.
And because of that, the whole authentication mechanism was built into the platform, and it was part of it. So people wouldn't really think about authentication in a company.
Because you would authenticate sort of through the VPN, right, to get access to the tools. And then it was like that, hardened shell GUI center we talk about from a security perspective, where once you're in, the apps didn't need authentication. They were already like,
yeah, exactly.
You had access to the system, you had access to everything.
Yeah, the firewall, had a big kind of like job there. It was the thing that really kind of separated the intranet users from the extranet users.
Right.
And even without VPN, like people would go to the office, plug to the LAN, right? So
right.
Anyway,
right.
that was back in the 2000s. The thing is that with the cloud and with smartphones, that thing changed, right? Like employees and people outside the company would try to use the systems from the company. And, we all gone through this. At some point, it was a mess to deal with that. Like, would you put the users in Active Directory, to put it in databases? And now, like, suddenly you start, like, creating silos of users across the organization with different databases, with users and passwords. And similarly with the cloud, like, suddenly, well, you don't own the data center from the cloud, so you cannot control what happens there. So that's yet another silo of users. So in a way, you needed an answer for that problem. And with Eugenio, back in the day, again, working this team called Patterns and Practices, we said, well, let's dive into like this whole idea of moving to the cloud and what we need to teach people about, right? And so we started first with a book that was called Moving Applications to the Cloud, which would explain a lot of these things. But quickly we realized that identity was the biggest subject there. So we wrote a book about that specifically. It was called something like An Introduction to Claims-Based Identity, something like that. And it was really like an architectural...
Sounds like a page turner.
Yeah, exactly. It's for me, it was also kind of a new term, a new thing. But really, it was kind of an architectural shift on how you would think about authentication and identity. The idea that the authentication process would be embedded in the application would be to change it to something that would be outside the application and would be something that you can use from different applications. And the fact that you create this architecture, this authentication service now would live in a different domain, in a central domain, where you create a cookie. And then because of that, every application would trust this centralized authentication service, and you would log in once there, and then applications would get the benefit of being logged in already in this central service. And that's what essentially means, single sign-on. It was this idea of this architectural change that we kind of put in black and white, and we explain how you could create that type of service.
Sure.
And from both sides, the company and from the service consumer and the service provider, right? Like both sides. Like again, like this. Remember, I think the first kind of like company that you would see doing something like this is Salesforce. It was like like the first company going through this kind of like enterprise readiness process, right? Like
yeah. I mean, I think they helped like write either like, parts of the SAML, like spec and SCIM and some of these other pieces around user provisioning and deprovisioning. So they were definitely kind of early to that.
Exactly. So we've gone through that transformation, and that was kind of like the seeing all that friction and like kind of like what software was out there to use, Active Directory Federation Services and Tivoli, IBM, and C8 SiteMinder. Like it was really, really complex to set all this up. And so that was a seed for starting Auth0, the product in 2013.
Okay, so let me just make sure I have this correct. So you were this consulting company that you were running. It grew pretty big, right? Like, there's like over 100 people there. I think today. So
today it's even more, yeah. But back in the days it was 100 people.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like a pretty good sized company. I'm sure you learned some lessons there around like hiring and managing and keeping people moving forward. So some very applicable lessons as a founder. And I mean, the other thing too is I always say like just even starting your first company is this very like scary proposition, kind of like staring into the abyss. And so you've done it once from that perspective, and now you're ready to do it from the product perspective, right?
Exactly.
And then I love this because you actually, you met your co-founder because he was a customer. And so there's this like sort of understanding one of the problem. You'd been exploring it together, inside as like, a Microsoft employee running partnerships and sort of trying to get more developers to adopt the Microsoft tool set, and then also as the consultant who's helping to kind of build some of those tools.
Exactly.
And so there's this great alignment, and I'm sure you sort of recognize that each other were good working partners. Where was he based when y'all were kind of getting started?
He was at the Corp kind of headquarters in Redmond. Okay. And that was actually great kind of like a test bed for us, because we would work remotely, back then. Like I was in Argentina, he was in Redmond.
Yeah, I mean, you were early to the whole remote world. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so then you saw the opportunity around, hey, as applications need to move to the cloud, authentication needs to sort of change, and I always think it's important to point out these platform shifts, right? So clearly the cloud changes architectures, changes how people need to implement like the tried and tested, ways of doing things before. And so now you're saying, okay, here's the opportunity. This is a complex problem that people can't solve. Like what was kind of next? Like, how did you decide we need to build this product around it, start a company around it? How did you think through that?
Yeah, of course, it wasn't that black and white, as every other startup. We started with the idea of building something like Okta or like One Login, if you know those products.
Sure. Yeah.
Our background was kind of working with enterprises, like as part of this was for Microsoft, as part of my work with this consulting company. We would implement this architecture, this kind of federated identity architecture in companies, big pharma companies and the likes. And so we would see every, different problems that would appear in that context. So, we ended up creating this first version, which was kind of like, like this dashboard to log into the different apps that you have as a company, and implemented this architecture for the company with a little bit more like developer kind of like feeling to it. Not just like, simply kind of plugging Salesforce and this and that and like SAML recipes. And so this was kind of like the beginning of it. And we realized, quickly, as we were talking to customers and potential customers and developers, that our kind of like big advantage was kind of understanding developers. And the idea that we would be solving this integration problem, right? And this was not just simply like the idea of, giving you the SAML kind of integration. It was beyond that. It was like, back then again, was the idea that like you would log in with Facebook and Google and this and that. And so every one of those integrations was, something that developers would have to code. And then you would say, but also we could help them as well with username and passwords and the whole email forgot flow. And it was kind of growing from there that like we started to realize that there is a lot of value that we could give to developers who are building applications, no matter if those applications are SaaS, internal applications, customer identity, kind of like portals. So it was like, this is actually interesting. Like instead of like building this kind of single sign-on portal, why don't we go a step below that? And we think about like a a building block for developers to do your own. Like you could build your single sign-on portal, you could build your SaaS application. Everything would use this kind of like identity platform building blocks, and we would make it easy for developers to embed this in functionality within your applications. So that was kind of like the realization in the first year, 2013. And of course, there was two things that really kind of resonated with us, and that helps us kind of like reinforce the product market fit. And it was pretty quick for us to get product market fit, I have to say. The timing was great. We started when this problem was kind of like not obvious, but also started to become something needed, right? So timing was very important. And then, developers, they started to use these kind of like services like Stripe and Twilio. So they started to make up their mind in terms of like, well, I can actually delegate some of the things that are maybe not that core to my business to other companies, right? Like, why would I do payment gateways, or why would like implement SMS gateways, right? Like that idea. And so we kind of like rode that wave. So timing. And then there was a third thing as well that was important. In 2010, I think 11 was the first kind of password breach, global password breach from PlayStation. Maybe you remember, it was like...
yeah, it was a massive one.
It was a massive one. 7 million accounts were hacked, and like those passwords were, available because they were like SHA-1 hashes and so on. And suddenly that kind of put like, perspective on like what it means to host and store email passwords and PII from users, right? So we kind of came in this 2013 in the middle of that kind of three different factors that were happening. And that kind of like helped us also reinforce that like we have a good thing. So, but during 2013, we ended up implementing and pivoting to this idea of selling to developers. And going back to these kind of two things, we had two things. So one was like Twitter. In Twitter, like developers would be saying, well, this is great. Like Auth0 helped me kind of integrate with these different social providers, and it's super easy to integrate, like SDKs and blah, blah. And also some would say about their SAML integration. So we had like some buzz there, and like we are solving something that definitely is interesting for some people. And then the second one was our first kind of enterprise customer. It was probably like every other company, like, getting that first enterprise customer, it's the whole journey. And that was also during the first year.
And so, I mean, like, talk about your earliest customers. Like, who were they? How did you find them? Before that enterprise customer, were you working with some early vendors? Like, who were those early? I mean, feels like maybe early on it wasn't just, kind of SaaS companies, but more like, consumer SaaS as well, like folks that were creating apps that you would sign in with Twitter and Facebook and stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was hobby developers, really. You had the typical hobby developer building something, maybe like their new startup, maybe a side project. Yeah, and they would use us because it would save them time to, just do the whole authentication piece. Instead of that, they would just spend the time on the stuff that they were going to do, right? So that was the initial kind of like audience, and in a way, like some word of mouth and stuff like that. This is a typical kind of developer go-to-market motion, where those same people who are creating those things as a side project, they typically also have their main job, right?
A real job, yeah. Which is very unique to developers.
Yeah.
If you think about like, no one in sales or customer success is like, oh yeah, I have a side job where I do, my side project, my side hustle is customer success. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense, right? So only developers actually practice their craft as like a hobby, and then do the same thing professionally, right? So it's this kind of very unique thing about that audience.
Totally. It's great. Yeah, it's great that we have this type of thing because it helps them like helps us experiment with things. And then like, oh, okay, this is cool. Like, let's take it, and so it's a great feedback loop and a virtuous cycle.
Well, real quick, those early customers, early developers, like, you could exclude them if you don't price correctly or if you don't do documentation correctly. So like, were these things that you really focused on? Like, what were your kind of core, did you have a hypothesis at that point around like, hey, here's how we can make sure we attract that audience and retain them? Was there like any, hey, we need to price it low or make it free? I don't know what you did in the beginning.
Yeah, it was tricky. I mean, and again, like we had this first idea where like we would sell to employees, and so it was like a per employee, and so that didn't work. But when we started to go to developers, we would look at Stripe would do like their pricing model is awesome because like you're charging completely value based. So we couldn't do that because we were not a part of like the transaction itself. Like we would be part of like the earlier piece of the transaction. So we couldn't do that. So we started looking at pricing by amount of users. There was some other companies doing that amount of like users that you would store in Auth0. They would create, like they would sign up. And the first kind of iterations of that were like very, very, very kind of manual. And like we would put like something in the website with like 3 tiers, I think. The typical, like free, and then like a kind of standard version, the pro version, and then I think we put in the first version like called the enterprise thingy as well, call us type of thing. Nobody called us initially, but as usual.
But just in case,
if someone would like to talk to us, here we are. Now we would do like, as you can imagine, like support ourselves, and we would talk to every customer. Like we had Intercom back in those days.
Sure.
They actually started together with us. They had, I remember very well, they had this kind of $50 kind of all you can eat plan.
Yeah.
Which was like a godsend. Like suddenly you could talk to customers, to developers, and through this interface, and we learned a lot. And so our first kind of self-service customer developer, we negotiated. I remember negotiating like to $24 a month. Like that's what we could pay, and we would create a custom plan for him in Stripe, and like, hey, go ahead and sign up here.
Amazing.
Anyway. So when we were doing the math of like, well, if we had to make a living out of this, it would take us a lot of developers to have revenue and to live from this, right? And it was, in fact, Eugenio has this like kind of contract signed with his wife on, if in 6 months you don't have the revenue, similar revenue to what you were making at Microsoft. He was working at Microsoft, then you go back to Microsoft type of thing, right?
Oh, funny.
Yeah. And we were like kind of like pressured to get revenue. Otherwise, we had really literally 6 months and so let's say we started in 2013. Our first kind of like self-service customers were like in kind of like March, April 2013, kind of 4 months in. And then we got this kind of lucky strike with this enterprise customer. I think every startup has to have these lucky strikes. Eugenio changed his LinkedIn when he started in February, let's say 2013, from Microsoft, to CEO of Auth0, and like someone from this big company who was part of his network saw that and kind of reached out to him saying, hey, well, congrats on the new job, whatever. Like our authentication system is down for 2 weeks. We don't know what to do, how to fix it. Can you help us with that? Like, are you doing something like that? Like that can help us? And of course we were like, yeah, sure, we can help you. We are not going to fix your system, but we can give you a product we are working on that would do exactly the same. They were using Active Directory Federation services. It was a big enterprise insurance company. We would give it to you and it would do the same thing. It would solve the same problems. And we would go out and make it happen for you. Of course, that wasn't that easy. But that's how we started that journey of selling to this enterprise customer.
Sure.
The person that reached out was kind of an enterprise architect in the company. So, he was like one of those people like, who has influence, but not decision or kind of purchase power. So it was a huge process of selling to that company. It took us from, I think, March to October to make that enterprise deal. And we were lucky because, well, first of all, like this guy saw this LinkedIn change and, one of those few people who read those emails of congratulations.
And just at the right time, right? Like, hey, this is top of mind. He sees this, all the things. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The whole thing was broken. Nobody knew how to fix it. Microsoft didn't know how to fix it.
Oh, funny.
And so Microsoft also kind of did this kind of like typical kind of big company thing of like consulting services and we're going to charge you, I don't know, $400,000 and we're going to do this kind of full re-architecture and like it was kind of consulting, kind of thing and plus new licenses and so on.
It's going to take 3 years and you're like, no, it's down right now. I need something now.
Exactly. That was our argument, really. Like, we're going to give it to you for half of that price. It was a great anchor, by the way. Like, we didn't have a clue of how to price it. Going from $24 a month to whatever, like $200,000 license, like we couldn't price that way ourselves. Like, so we had this anchor, which was like what this other company was charging them to re-architect their system. But it took us a long time to sell to this first company. We have to go through security and all the typical stuff that you go through. We were like 5 people startup. We had to and this is where like the on-prem version started actually. Our version back then was running in Heroku.
Oh, interesting.
And it was the Node.js and MongoDB. And luckily it was Node.js and MongoDB because if it would have been something like, I don't know, .NET and SQL Server, which was our background,
yeah,
we couldn't have done that like easily, I would say, right? Like with that architecture, we were able to move this Heroku up to, like Puppet. It was used back then, Puppet and VMware, kind of like OVF. And and we ended up rewriting the thing in three weeks, like re-architecting to make it work in the on-prem.
Oh, wow. One
of the things that you only do when you are desperate for revenue, right?
Or, when it's part of your overall strategy, who knows?
Well, yeah, that was the learning, of course, right? It was the learning.
No, I totally get it. Like at that time, the idea of like, hey, we're a SaaS company and we're going to be a SaaS company, and you have a customer that needs a version of on-prem. Be able to deliver something like that in 3 weeks is
yeah. And remember that we were on Heroku and we didn't have a lot of people, so it was a decision, right? Like, hey, let's do this. And now suddenly it became part of the strategy of like, okay, we are this universal platform that can be deployed anywhere.
Yeah, it's it was kind of definitely very different time from that perspective. So okay, so now you have this big enterprise customer, and this is like you had some developers that were paying, some were paying you $24 a month. Like when did you really kind of start to feel like you had the pull from the market, right? I remember at some point being on like Hacker News or something, and people just assuming you were like Auth0 was kind of like a tool that you would just use, like just one of the things you would use to build an app, kind of like Stripe or something else. Like when did that transition sort of happen?
Yeah, so that this customer we signed them in October 2013. Then we had a couple of acquisition offers as well. So it was kind of like all at the same time. Like you would see this it seems that we are solving something that a lot of different people are interested in, like developers, enterprises, and investors. We actually didn't raise money until then. We didn't even have experience raising money because the previous stuff was not a startup. And we would start with the company. So like that was, what I was telling before, like we had to have revenue, like because we didn't know how to do this thing in a different way. Like we didn't have any network of people that we could tap into and ask money. Like 2013 also was a different time, right? Like, especially like we were from LATAM and like the awareness of like raising capital wasn't there.
Sure.
So anyway, but the thing is that we got all these signals and acquisition offers and this and that. And so that was kind of like the initial feeling of the pull from the market. And we decided when we declined these offers, which was kind of a whole separate chapter, we ended up saying, well, let's go all in and build a company. And we suddenly realized that, well, maybe we need to raise money and we need to go big in a way, because it seems that this is we were at the right time and doing the right thing, and otherwise someone else is going to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so we raised money, and when you raise money and then you do the PR thing, and like, it's kind of like this cycle, right, of hacker news. And especially back then, again, like, there wasn't much. Now there's much more stuff out there, right? And so harder maybe to get signal, but 2013, still hard, but you can start to see, especially for developers, word of mouth, and when a company starts to get traction and so on, you start to feel that. And in 2014, we started to get more of these inbound requests from enterprises, and it was pretty much all inbound. And and that's where, like, okay, well, we need to hire a salesperson. And eventually 2015 we raised Series A, hired a VP of sales, and it continued from there.
And so, and I guess, like, kind of reflecting back, right, being developer focused on a technical topic that both enterprises and startups are interested in. You talked about pricing for, like, some of these. Was there a free tier that you could use, like, in the beginning or at some point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a free tier. Yeah, absolutely. It was critical for the developer motion.
Yeah. Okay. Because you're not open source either, right? So, like, a lot of the kind of other developer motion, oftentimes GitLab or someone else would focus on open source. So this is a proprietary service with a free tier. And how did you differentiate between the free tier plan and the sort of paid plans? Like, was it about number of users, about the team size? Like, what were the identifiers there?
Yeah, we were pretty generous with the free tier, and we always been, and it's still the case. We had like 7,000 monthly active users for free.
Oh, wow.
Which is a lot. Like, you don't realize how much that is until you start and then you try to do a business that has monthly active users consistently. So 7,000 is a lot. And so we always wanted developers to just try the thing. We didn't have high COGS because of the attached to these things. So, and usually what happens is that, like, hobby developers start something, maybe 5% of those things actually pick up. So it's not really like very heavy on the load side when you think about the free tier for us, right? So, we had a generous free tier, and the features that kind of were available for the next tier were things like, for example, the whole SAML integration stuff. You would typically want the SAML integration when you're actually selling to an enterprise customer. So that means that you're already making money. And of course, if you have more MAUs than 7,000, it also means that you're doing something well. There are some tricky scenarios where, like, B2C kind of like massive, amount of users where, like, that starts to become harder. But more or less, like, that was the thing. And there were features that would turn into the next tier, like SAML integration. Like, we had a feature called custom database connections, which it was a whole other chapter, but, like, our whole extensibility model also was baked into the system early on. And it was a learning from these first enterprise customers. When we were trying to deploy the solution to them, they had this issue where, like, well, okay, I like your stuff, but, I have all these users in my databases that I cannot just migrate easily because downtime and, like, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
So we came up with the way for, instead of, like, doing just webhooks, because this was part of, like, the whole login transaction, and it was kind of a synchronous thing. Webhooks wouldn't work in this case. So we would allow the customer to write code in the dashboard, in our dashboard, Node.js code that we would execute on behalf of them, that would whatever they want. And so they would connect to their own database, which was, I think, a SQL server, whatever. And that was a key thing for us to get into that deal. And we were able to solve that problem.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like this, almost like a function as a service, like inside of the platform. Yeah.
We didn't call it that way back then, but it was serverless.
Yeah.
It was serverless, essentially. Like, we created a function as a service engine that would solve that problem. Using Docker and stuff back then that was available, and that would solve the problem of called startup and stuff like that. And we started using that pattern more and more throughout the code, throughout the pipeline. Like, for example, another requirement that this company had was that they had to connect when the user logged in. they would have to retrieve certain authorization data from another web service that they had. They had a SOAP web service, like SOAP. I'm talking about early days of the internet and web services. And we didn't want to have like an integration for web services that was hard coded in the product. And so we did the same thing. We opened up a hole in the code where after the login happened, you could run a piece of code that would enrich the token with more information. That would come from whatever you want. Like you would do whatever you want. Like you could call some API of yours and return access denied if something happened. And so this was a very compelling part of our system. And even today, it's one of the big differentiators that we have. I would say that a big percentage, I think something like 80-90% of our customers extend the platform this way.
Oh, wow.
So it's been a great tool also for the sales engineers. Imagine like suddenly you don't have to ask your product team to implement, this sub web service integration, and like they could do it on their own, writing the code, and which is kind of like writing a script, right? So
sure,
it was pretty convenient.
I love that. And so, that's a great feature that sort of like makes your product more extensible, makes it easier for you to like integrate into these custom things that folks need, but also just shows like how developer focused you were, right? Like
exactly,
hey, this is part of the product that's core. And was documentation something that you focused on early on too? I mean, that's generally like
oh yeah.
How much of that did you write?
Yeah, I mean, me and Eugenio would write most of it initially.
Yeah,
and we had a great background by working for Microsoft. This was the big learning at Microsoft. Like they really paid a lot of attention to that. MSDN, was the gold standard back in the days, right, of documentation for Microsoft.
Sure.
But we would write books and hands-on labs and samples, and we really learned what it meant to be a product for developer, working for Microsoft. It was a big learning. And so the documentation aspect was, we spent a big amount of time on that. Like there were two things that we pioneered back then. Like one was like having this kind of like quick start selector thingy, right? Like you could pick your platform, whatever it is. We have a lot of them. And the second thing is that we would tailor the documentation to the API keys that the developer already had created for their account. So you would just literally copy paste the code. You wouldn't have to go and fetch and see what the API keys and like this and that. Nobody was doing that back then. So it was a big, that was a thing that like developers kind of like would say in Twitter, like this developer experience is great. Like, because they would just get it working quickly because they could copy paste stuff. I think Stripe was doing something similar back in the days as well, but we were like going all in to that, like replacing everything and making it really copy pasteable.
I love that. Yeah. And, I mean, throughout that time, like you're continuing to add new customers, right? And I think what's interesting, I looked at your pricing page now and you kind of have these different, like you price by use case, right? Which is interesting and kind of unusual, right? You price for B2C, you price for B2B, and then you have this sort of like what I'm going to call internal enterprise pricing as well. And so you probably have thought about your product as like those, like as those different, customer use cases and segments throughout that time. Clearly the developer is still at the foundation of each of those and their experience is quite similar, but then the use case and the value that you're bringing, because this is a challenge for a lot of companies is like, how do I price for high volume, low ASP kind of consumery folks? And how do I price for, lower volume, high ASP, type users? And, and understanding, because any one of those B2B companies, like every user is worth a lot more than a B2C company. And so the value is different there.
Exactly. I mean, I told you, like we started as thinking about like, this is a platform for developers that could help you solve any use case on the authentication side. But clearly, when we started selling the product more and more, we would see this segmentation of, B2C type of customers, like, media or retail or like all these companies who would sell to consumers versus the companies who were like more like SaaS or like companies who would be like these partner portals, right? Like, and then of course the internal single sign-on. And so initially we didn't want to complicate the pricing model. And so we did this kind of like single pricing model for whatever like scenario you are in. Over time, like that you see now, we separated it and make it more tailored to the use case because of the reasons you say, like it's not the same a B2C user than a B2B user from a value point of view, and same for internal users. But, in the early days, I think simplicity was the most important piece. And the trick here is like, you can do it essentially by just putting a pricing page, a very simple pricing page, and then have the enterprise thing. And so when you would call the enterprise and you would have a conversation, then like you're in a complete different context. And you can have a conversation about your amount of users. And, if you're in a B2C scenario, then you would have bigger discounts and so on, right? Like, and so I think we did the right thing in the early days. Now it's like, well, we evolved it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so you were kind of letting folks raise their hand if the initial pricing model didn't work, right? You'd be like, tell us if this is, if you need to fix this.
Yeah, it's risky because you also can, kind of self-select out people. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the market is so big, and this is a need that every application customer globally has, and so, it's fine.
Yeah, and so one thing just for listeners, I want to focus here, on the story of Auth0, and then towards the end, I want to make sure we get into, a lot more about, single sign-on and role-based access control, because, those are core features of EnterpriseReady, and so I think, having your perspective on how to build those will be really interesting. But before we do, I want to move from kind of Auth0 to a little bit more around your role there, right? So you were a co-founder, you've been the CTO the whole time. I'm guessing you were managing all of the product and engineering stuff early on. Like, how did your role evolve as the company grew? And like, how do you see your role today?
Yeah, so I made a few presentations on different conferences about this evolution of the CTO role.
Oh, cool.
You can search that on Google, because I actually talk about this journey that I've gone through. I think CTO Craft is the conference. And also SaaStr, I did a presentation about that. The role changes, of course, right? Like, I'm a creator, I'm an inventor, and that's where my energy comes in. And so as any other like person that is driven by that, at some point, like managing a lot of people and having these big organizations, it ends up being something that you don't enjoy as much as kind of being close to creating product. And so from 2013 to, I would say, 2018, so 5 years, I kind of build the organization, design, engineering, product, security, and I was managing all of that. In 2013, we hired a CISO. So that was the first kind of like thing that I put off my responsibility. In 2018, we had a VP of engineering, and so I handed off the whole engineering side of things. And in 2019, we hired a chief product officer, and so I handed off the whole product.
Okay.
So what do I do now? So during that process, kind of also was like, okay, how do I change my role now, and like what do I want to do, and kind of finding my ikigai, right? Like again, as part of a bigger company. And so I started like this office of a CTO, which is one way that you could go.
Sure.
And this essentially, in every company, office of CTO might mean something else. If you go to VMware, you would probably have like, 40, 50 people kind of being these kind of like field CTOs that would kind of go to big accounts and would kind of help them with their architecture and so on. I didn't want to do that. I mean, I love being in a customer call, but that's not what I enjoy doing more. I like building. So the model we ended up creating is kind of these two horizons. Horizon one is kind of 18 months, and that's what VP of product, VP of engineering are responsible for. They report to a chief product officer. And I also ended up reporting to a chief product officer instead of reporting to a CEO, because that also was kind of eliminating a lot of frictions, right? And so I focus on the second horizon, which is 18 plus month roadmap, meaning that I mostly incubate things, but they don't see the light for at least a year and a half. and there is a whole transition thing happening, and it's quite tricky to make that work in the right way. So I had a lot of learnings doing that, going through that.
Yeah.
But eventually we made it work, and we released our first kind of incubated product in last year. It's a fine-grained authorization, which is this Google Zanzibar inspired service, and that was incubated in this way. It was something that took us a year long to build, talking to customers, engage the community through Discord, and like it's kind of going back to those early days of building, but in a much better context now, because we have customers we can talk to, we have a brand we can use to engage with people, we have dev revs, and so it's actually a very joyful process to build this way too.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, it's an interesting, evolution, right? Kind of going from you were running the whole shebang on that side. It's not really what you loved. You're kind of doing it because like you had to, right? And then now getting to go in and go and build things again and get early, but have the support of the rest of the organization, and then know that like, hey, you can kind of, experiment. And, one thing my co-founder and I always talk about, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, is the early phases of building something, right? The sort of 0 to 1 stage is a lot of like 0 to 0.3 and then back to 0. And then to like 0.4, and then like throw it all away and back to 0, and then, build something again. And then eventually when you get to 1.0, then it's actually as incremental as people would think, right? It's 1.1, 1.2, on and on and on. But the early days, we'll build something and throw it away multiple times. And I don't think everybody loves that, right? I think like some folks, don't want to see their work. They're like, I want to plan this out and have this, kind of work. And so does that resonate for you in terms of how you think about building?
Yeah, totally. When I started to think about this thing, because in the early days, it's like, everyone is doing everything, and like you're not even thinking about what you're doing, right? Like, but once you kind of, you've gone through the whole like cycle of scale, and you're in that process, but you're trying to now like stepping back. I started to read about these things, and you would find like the frameworks from Ken Beck, from the typical S-curve of how the software evolves, right? Like what you were saying with the incremental piece, and other interesting articles like from this guy Wardley, the Wardley Maps guy. He wrote an article about pioneers, settlers, and town planners, which is an interesting analogy for like the different type of people that enjoy different things and get energy from different things, right? And the pioneers are okay with the ambiguity, are okay with this 0 to 0.3 and go back to 0, like the frustrations of doing that, and the
whiplash, yeah.
Not having a lot of customers to talk to because they don't understand actually what you're solving for, and like trying to find that. So those are the pioneers, the ones who kind of land into the island trying to conquer something that there is nothing there. But once something, you build like those little houses in there, and like you start to understand where to get food from and so on, the settlers come in, right? And these are the people who know how to scale the system and know how to build maybe bigger houses and with better materials and so on. And they are okay with other things as well, right? Like they are okay with the incremental value. And of course, then you have like the town planners who are like the ones who, once the whole thing is built and now you need some sort of like process and governance for this place, right? And for this product. And that's where, but the key thing of this article that I think stick to me is like, it says there are brilliant pioneers, there are brilliant sellers, and there are brilliant town planners. Because sometimes we associate like, the pioneers and like these people to like the great people, like the inventors and like the brilliance, right? But the reality is that you need the three of them, and you need brilliant people in each of these categories in order to create a company. So, yeah. But it's important to realize this kind of like different type of people exist.
Yeah. And then, also acknowledge, sure, you clearly you did a great job as a settler as well, right? And, and even taking it to town planning, but like, those are not the areas where you're really find energy. That's probably like was more draining for you and was more like, yeah. So then you can, now return to like your, not just what are you capable of, but where are you sort of like in your in flow? Where do you find Zen? So
yeah, and of course this is super common. I talk to a lot of CTO co-founder because I'm sure like you know a lot of people like that has gone through it or is going through this, and there is not a lot of material out there. Like there is not a lot of experience from people on going through this transition and documenting it, right? Like it's either kind of you get lost in the organization, eventually you leave, or you stay in this kind of like ambiguous role where like you're doing something but you're actually don't enjoying it much.
Sure.
And you keep going, but there is no value in doing that. And so I think it's a pretty critical thing. And I learned myself throughout the process. I think I should have hired like a VP of engineering earlier than I did. But that's what it is.
Yeah, no, there's always those key hires you look back on and you're like, oh, I wish I would have had this person like 3 years before I had them. It's like my life would have been better.
The problem is when you hire that person and it wasn't the right one, and so like it's even worse.
Yeah, no, sometimes you make a few mistakes and have, and like oftentimes it's like the organization wasn't ready for that person to come in, and like there's different challenges. So it's not always, that person's fault specifically, but it's kind of that person organization fit. So
totally.
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing across the board. So, and to your point around not much content, not much like out there about this topic, I think as a CEO, I find so much content and so many advisors, so many of our investors, like, can give me advice. And so the one thing that I'm kind of constantly looking for are like, hey, like my co-founder, Mark, needs like this mentorship and advisors and other folks that can give him feedback. And we've had, we have a handful of folks that have been really great about that, but we had to actively search it out. Whereas like if you're a CEO, like everybody has advice for you. Like it's like all the VCs, it's like
there are CEO groups.
Yeah.
I agree with you. That happened to me. Like, yeah, like I could never really find a good support group. I mean, even though I had like, the VC, Bessemer would have like this kind of meeting every X amount of time, or like you could meet the city, but it wasn't really, I needed someone like that really gone through the whole thing as a CTO co-founder that I could relate experiences with. I never had that. So I think there is more people now aware, and like, it's a cycle, right? Like,
Yeah. And, and you out there giving talks about it, it sounds like a great one. I'll make sure my CTO and I both watch it together so that we have that context. So we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and I always sort of joke about like the features, like the enterprise-ready features, right? There's like 11 or 12 of the core features, and two of them, right, single sign-on and role-based access control, are like very core. And oftentimes, single sign-on is kind of the first thing that folks will do in order to make their B2B SaaS application or enterprise application more enterprisey. And one of the comments is like, when people do that, they often look at these things like, oh, a SAML integration, or oh, like a Google Auth integration, or like, oh, some type of integration that allows me to piggyback on some federated login. I can build that in a week or two, right? But the reality is, with a lot of these more complex features, that like you can basically get, a working demo done in a week or two, but you don't get any of the nuance and the security and the sort of, and you don't have the experience of knowing what are the gotchas that you might hit and what are going to be the challenges. And so, tools and products that actually solve those problems, as a service or for you, I think can be super, super valuable. And so when you think about just the overall, like how to build great single sign-on, hit on a couple of those gotchas, hit on a couple of those, one thing I do occasionally, like when I look at, if you want to find a plethora of sort of gotchas, like I often search for some kind of, feature plus like HackerOne, and you can basically read like all the authentication, and login, like mistakes that people have made or done with, forgot password HackerOne, and you'll like see all the security vulnerabilities that people have revealed, and you're like, oh, don't do that, right? So you basically create a laundry list of things that you like shouldn't do by learning what like other people have paid bounties on.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if you have, some of those ideas, that things that like come to mind around, why should folks be building, single sign-on, and then, the advantages of leveraging something like Auth0.
Yeah, I think that you can probably create a list of 20 things that would happen that you have to take into account when you write these things, like in 20 and being generous maybe.
Sure.
The key aspect of this is the following. Once you grow, because everything is fine, and again, like when you're starting your company, everything, like you just do whatever, doesn't matter, like you don't want to spend any dime on anything. The thing is that when you grow, and that's something that you learn only when you grew, right? When you became a certain size and so on, suddenly every piece of your product will have to have someone who is the watchman for that piece, right? And sure, like you could have a platform team that, kind of like takes care of the whole thing, but eventually there's going to be a need for changing the authentication piece. There's going to be a need for adding functionality to that thing. There's going to be a need for fixing a security vulnerability to that, and countless of other things. And you will have forgotten who wrote that piece, and if it was you as a CTO, well, even worse, like because it means that nobody touched it. So at the end of the day, it has to do with that. It's you want to be prepared for that future. And if you assume that you're going to grow and you want to become bigger, then either you think about the headcount that you will need in 5 years for the team that would own this piece of functionality, or you make a smarter decision and you just say, well, instead of hiring people in the future, I just use a service. And of course, it's fine to do that later, but like you can start like with your own and then move. But the reality is that today often it's like startup plans, and there is a lot of ways to start with, something with a low price, get done with it and make sure that also it's secure, that it's protected from different attacks. Like it implements all the SAML functionality that you will find down the road of like this quirky customer who is using CA SiteMinder 3.5 and has like this canonicalization algorithm that you never thought about, and now suddenly you have to change the library that you're using for SAML, which is a mess, or like finding this PR from someone who sent the fix for that problem, and now you have to use a fork that is not the main one. Anyway, you get the point, right? Like that's the main thing to take into account. You don't wanna be in that position when you grow, and so it's better just to, in general, and in fact, this was the thing early on when we had our first big customer. It was Atlassian in 2016. They came to us because it was this mandate across the company for like everything that can be outsourced, we should outsource. That was coming from the co-founders of the company, because they realized that, developers are a scarce resource, and you don't want to spend those resources in things that there is no differentiation on. In a world where like you have enough money and resources to spend on things, and you should just spend it on the right things. So anyway, that's that was a big learning from me when I was watching that happening from like this big company with tons of developers is deciding to outsource such a core piece of their product. That was kind of like the realization of like, when you become big, those are the problems that you end up having. Like, you need to really focus and use the right people on the right things.
Yeah, that's sort of, we think about the idea of build versus buy in the same sense, right? Where you're like, the idea that you could write it, a crappy version of this in 2 weeks that's going to have a bunch of gaps, and even if you're okay with those gaps, to your point, like if then in a year you need to do something different, or someone discovers a security bug and submits it to your HackerOne, then is that person still there? Number one, right? Did they leave? Or if they are still there, great. Now they have to like reload all the context of what they wrote and get back into this. Whereas if you have a team behind it, well, hopefully they've been updating the platform all along, and the company that you are using as a vendor is helping you avoid that problem. But even if a problem does arise, like somebody has context, right? And even if it's like, hey, great, I need to upgrade this version or update something, there's like a customer success manager who can like walk you through that, and a support team. and they kind of have all the context already. And so
Exactly.
It's funny. I often say, like, particularly it's within a big company, right? What you're going to see is they have tons of different applications that they're developing. And if without you, they're using all different forms of authentication, and, every team's going to do it differently. And so by like kind of centralizing and standardizing, there's like a consistent way to do things. And then that makes it even more repeatable and easier for one person to move from one team to another, because they don't have to get super familiar with some new tooling.
Yeah. And there is nuance, of course, right? Like we're going through the same thing now with authorization, right? Like I told you, we're releasing this fine-grained authorization service. The nuance here is that like sometimes there are like open source versions of these things, right?
Sure.
And that is okay, and that is fine, and that is great. But yeah, ultimately, what happens is that open source version still you have to host it, manage it, and that's why open core is a successful model, because at the end of the day, you don't want to even spend the time of like the DevOps people running this stuff, unless that is really core to our value proposition. But 95%, 99% of the companies, that's not the case. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There's so many of these common services that, to your point, are non-differentiating, that when you look at it, you're like, do we need this to be something that we own, or do we want to create value, through actual features, right? Like, is this a thing that like really changes our, differentiates us from the rest of the market, which often it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense for, for the authentication side. And so talk more about the new thing you've built, around RBAC as well. Like, what's that functionality? When you mentioned Zanzibar, like talk a little bit about what Zanzibar is, and give us some context on that new offering.
Yeah. So, in the same way that authentication, in a way, like we managed to find a way to generalize it, through these protocols and standards and OpenID Connect and OAuth and JSON Web Tokens and so on, it's been great. There is nothing like that in the authorization side of things, right? And everybody like who has implemented authorization, it's it's part of your application. If you did RBAC, then you have a database with table with roles in it, with maybe some permissions that chat switch, the ones who implemented it, who realized that they had to decouple roles from permissions, and then you have users related to those roles. And that is kind of the very basic roles story, right? Like, you're an admin, you're an editor, you're like whatever, right?
Right.
And that works. That's fine. But usually when you start like going up market and you find like more complex domains like healthcare, actually in every other domain there are like complexities, right? And usually the permissions are also attached to other things than simply just roles. The things that you can do in a certain application, right? You can have permissions based on a certain attributes of a user, which is something that we support. But then you also have like concept of hierarchies of things, right? For example, in GitHub you have organizations, and that organization has repos, and that organization has groups or teams of users, and you might want to give access to one user to a certain repo, to a team, to a certain set of repos. And so you start like to visualize this kind of like hierarchy of things. Or Google Docs would be another example, where you have folders with documents, and you want to assign permissions to groups or individual users or groups of groups. And so suddenly you have like this kind of graph of entities, of principles and resources, that you actually want to do RBAC in that context, not just simply like an editor in this thing. And so there is no generic way of solving that problem. So everybody is solving it again and again. And the guys from Google implemented this kind of generic, global, consistent authorization system across all their products, which is called Google Zanzibar. They realized this is an issue that they would be solving over and over. And so they would kind of factor out the core functionality of each of these different implementations that they had across YouTube, Gmail, Calendar, you name it. Like every one of their products has authorization needs, right? So, and they wrote a paper once it's an internal system. You cannot use it. You cannot buy it from Google. But they wrote a paper with the ideas and the semantics of this system. And they're kind of not the technical architecture, but the conceptual architecture of that thing. Like, what is a language for where you can express these hierarchies that I was talking about, the different entities that exist and the relationship between the different entities. So they wrote that, and so we started Auth0 in 2013. So, like, let's say it's been like 8-9 years. To us, it felt like, okay, well, we did this with authentication. I think it's time now for authorization to have its moment of at least give it a try. Right? We need to give it a try and see if there is a way to optimize and to commoditize this piece of infrastructure and make it available for more people and for developers who usually start with this simple model, and then when they go up market, they had to rewrite their whole authorization system because it was not enough. So we came up with this implementation of Google Zanzibar. This was part of this team that I lead with the Office of CTO. We call it Auth0 Lab. And so what we did is we started in, let's say, January last year. We started talking to customers. Of course, we had a lot of customers to talk to because authorization is pretty adjacent to our authentication.
Pretty well aligned.
Yeah, we have an offering on already for RBAC, very simple RBAC. But we want to learn more, right? And so we talk to different type of customers, and this type of situation, it's very common. Like they usually have complex authorization systems.
Okay.
But the thing that we wanted to validate first and foremost was that, is this Zanzibar implementation, I mean, it works for Google, clearly, they implemented it. But could it work for others? And so that was kind of like the validation that we've gone through. And so we created this playground first, where you could go for free. It's a free tool. You could go and try to model your system, authorization system. And so we had tons of customers going through that. Initially we helped them. We would do a session with them where we would ask them questions and we would kind of map out. And so we learned, what would be the best way to express their authorization model. We came up with a better kind of semantics for the language than what Google provided. And so we started learning and what are the other things that we need to solve in the domain? And we created these different kind of artifacts for this service. And we released and we open it up more now to developers. There is a developer community preview that we put out there. And so now anyone can go and try it out and build their system, authorization system with it. Yeah, and eventually it will go GA sometime, hopefully this year for enterprise customers. So, and that's kind of the process, going back to the previous question on model for the CTO who wants to continue to build. This is an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, this sort of hearing that, research phase, development phase, early access, and then sort of a beta and then GA process. Yeah, I mean, it's super important for companies to be able to do that as they scale and grow. But two, so in terms of this, you mentioned some differences between this offering and the RBAC offering you have. When you think about and you mentioned sort of maybe RBAC in your mind is a little bit more narrow to it's more about users and permissions and less about the hierarchy of actual objects. Is that sort of right? Yeah,
exactly. So you can model more complex domains essentially. So going back to GitHub as an example. So you have repos, you have organizations that has teams, and inside those repos you might even have more kind of fine-grained entities that you want to manage. But I think repos is the lowest denominator there. And so the way that GitHub solves it today is likely just storing everything in a database attached to the repo ID. And so the roles and everything ends up being in a database table. The moment that you start having more systems that depend on that information, now you depend on that table where you store all these, right? So the idea of this system of this authorization service that is global and accessible for all applications is that you think about your model in a central way, in a single place, right? And then every application can consume that. It's kind of like thinking of like a authorization microservice that beyond just like, what role is Grant in? It's like, what permission does Grant has in for this resource?
Sure.
It's one more, and you could belong to some hierarchy that gives you access because you belong to that hierarchy. And similar to in the resources side of things, right? Like maybe, there is a collection of repositories that all together has a management and permissions associated to that. And so there is a lot of examples like this in the real world. Like, for example, a company that sells publications, research publications, the papers, and they sell typically in collections of papers of a certain topic. And so they want to give access to different collections to different people and different teams inside the organization instead of single persons. So anyway, it's essentially a system that allows you to model those type of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the key difference there for me is, identifying that it's not just about users and like what are their access permissions broadly, but it's like being able to take that and then pairing it with a grouping hierarchy of resources and saying like, that way there's some inheritance that you can have across both sides, but really that the matching making it really important. That's cool.
Yeah. And then of course it's like everything else. It's like, well, this is an API that solves you this problem for you. But then if you think about audit logs, for example, like, this also can give you that audit level kind of out of the box for like every ACL check that happened or every change in the permission system, or when you want to change your permission system because now it's something else, you added. That's a very big kind of like engineering project usually. Like when you want to change your authorization system, right? And so this thing has kind of the concept of versioning built in. And so, the thing that it also solves for you is that the fact that now you have a central authorization service that is used across all your application systems, services, whatever, is that you get like auditing out of the box. You get versioning, which is also a big problem usually when you want to change your authorization domain model. That is not an easy change. You want to do it in a way that, you do kind of shadow type of strategies where, you start trying and see if your model replies the same thing now or like it changed the answer. And so we thought about all those stuff as well, like the things that you typically end up doing when you're solving authorization at scale.
That makes sense. And you mentioned like a DSL, kind of some kind of way to set all this up, right? Is it like a custom DSL, or did you model it after anything? And can you like port in a manifest and like is that what you use to sort of version this across, if you want to kind of version control how you set this all up?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you have initially we started with the dreaded YAML, of course, and I think Google actually also does YAML in the paper. But yeah, once we started talking to customers, like it was very hard to grok and to understand what's going on, and in that when you were reading this, and we ended up with like our own little language that would allow you to express a lot of these things, but in a much simpler, like natural language way.
Okay.
You can look at it in the playground that we have. I think it's play.fca.dev. That's you would see there like different examples of authorization models.
Oh, cool.
Like we have GitHub, we have G Drive, we have like an IoT example, Slack, Slack with channels and all sorts of things, entitlements, and so on.
Oh, it's funny you call it the DSL, the domain specific language. I like it. And so, like as a developer, I would version control this either as JSON or as a DSL, and then I would kind of move that along into different environments.
Yeah, exactly.
It's cool. And so this is pretty new. Is this like when did you launch it?
Yeah, we launched it in I think December, and as part of building the thing throughout the 2021, we also engaged with the community. That was an interesting kind of like going back to building product in 2021, right? Like when I was doing it, there was no kind of concept of Discord, for example, or the community, right, of developers. Where you would find the community of developers us, maybe Twitter, maybe Hacker News, but now you have these kind of chats that are, that people can join. And it was great because we were able to have like a channel with the community where we would discuss things, in a similar way where, like the open source happens. And, we would talk about things and discuss and tell people when we would release something new. And it was great to kind of like go back to that kind of motion.
Interesting. Yeah. So I just saw the community. And so I guess that's another interesting insight for folks that are building kind of developer-based companies, that like the idea of using Discord to really like build community and let folks connect. You found that to be pretty successful?
Yeah, I mean, it's yet another way to, at the end of the day, to learn. When you're building a product, you want to optimize for learning, and learning comes in different ways. From, again, like in our case, we would want to talk to developers who have gone through this problem, who has implemented something like this. So we would have different sources of those developers. Of course, our customers are one of those sources. You don't want to disrupt them and ask them all the time for kind of help but you typically find these kind of like core customers that they are really desperate for a type of solution like this, and they would give you time, right? But you also want to find developers who are like, the developers who maybe have more times in their hands and they are interested in these things as well. And so by engaging these people as well, you also have a different type of input. But yeah, most importantly is how do you learn faster and more?
Yeah. And from a wide variety of sort of target sort of users, right? You don't want just like one profile. You want, think about your use cases. You have those 3 different profiles pretty clear. So
exactly.
That's great. Well, Matias, anything that we missed here? Anything else you want to chime in with?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that we didn't touch on is like Auth0 became merged with Okta in March last year. And so it's been a little bit of a change. But yeah, that's been a ride now. It's been a year almost.
Yeah. A huge acquisition. I still remember at the time it was like pretty well received in the market. So, it was a $6.5 billion acquisition. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's huge. Yeah, congrats on that. And I'm sure it seems like a great fit for an acquirer. To your point, more of a merger because it's like 2 different ends of the spectrum in terms of solving different parts of the problem, and being able to bring those together, I think, can be better for both the end user, right, or the service, provider and the service consumer, right? So that's really, I'm sure it's been a great combo. Yeah,
when we were thinking about, and by the way, this acquisition, I think there is a whole chapter around acquisitions and like for founders, right? Like how you think about acquisition. Like we got a lot of offers throughout the different years. In fact, Okta tried to acquire us since 2013, the first year.
Oh, funny.
Every year, like we would talk to Todd and like exchange notes.
And reminds me of PayPal and eBay. eBay tried to acquire PayPal 6 times, and the prices kept getting higher and higher. Eventually, they were like, "We just got to buy it.
Exactly.
We don't care the price. Give it to us."
Yeah, it was a little bit like that. Of course, it makes a lot of sense for Okta. In fact, I would say we wouldn't have sold the company really. Like we were going IPO, and but the only company that we said, well, this will be because it will be very strategic for them, and for us, it will be great also for customers and the potential impact that we can have, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about this kind of idea of the 2 ends of the same pipe, right? Like they sell their product mostly to IT organizations who are connecting to SaaS applications. They want to do single sign-on with between those applications, and we sell to the ones writing those applications. So those developers who have the power to change the fabric between the one or the other. And if you think now about the function authorization service, like I was talking about, or authentication, by having this system in place and these domains specified in a certain way, well, we could make, if you use Okta on one side, if you use Auth0 on the other side, now we could have all sorts of efficiencies in the channel, right? because we know, that you're using a certain thing, and so, make the life easier for the IT people, but also for the developers and also for the end user at the end of the day. And that's where like the mission thing is exciting, because we want to enable that type of thing, like use any technology by any person in a most efficient way. That is only possible when you have this type of thing in hand, right? And that's what made us say, okay, this could actually be good for users and customers if we do it in a way also that is, that we promote standards and not just like, it would only work with Auth0 and Okta, right? And that's kind of the spirit of the company.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those companies I've always had a lot of respect for. I think a lot of folks do as well. So again, very, very excited for that. And I'm sure you've got some stories as part of those acquisitions, right? Those are like interesting overtures and, probably too, because it's like, they've always been a key partner, right? You've always probably worked with them, integrated with their things. And so, there's always this proximity and, I'm guessing the markets being pretty generous over the last, throughout the pandemic were a nice way for them to feel like, okay, we have to take advantage of where we are today and, the multiples that we have and really try to build this business out. So I'm sure that was a good move. Yeah,
it's been a great journey. Like, of course, integrations are complex and there is people involved and it's not all roses when you do these type of things. But there are some key, of course, learnings and aspects of situations like this that make things better. But the main, most important thing is, to be aligned on that, on the mission and also become part of a company who really wants that thing, right? And that's a key piece. And they Todd, the CEO, really wanted to have this. They would sell to IT, we sell to developers, and it's a DNA that you have to born with, right? And they born with the IT DNA, sysadmin, like the whole CISO, CIO side of the house, and we born with the developer, CTO, VP engineering. But most importantly, I think that the way that we think about customers and the values that we both kind of share is what makes things work or not. And so far it's been a good journey.
I love it. Well, Matias, thank you so much. I know we're running up on the end of our time here. We had a hard stop, but amazing. Like really, really appreciate your time and you're being so open with us and sharing kind of the backstory and then how things are going and what you've been up to. So this was great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Grant. Thanks for the great podcast, and we'll be in touch.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.